In the spring of 1946, a clerk at the International Red Cross office in Geneva opened a canvas mailbag marked "Undeliverable, Return to Sender." Inside were 47 letters, all written in careful German script, all addressed to the same village outside Munich. The first letter was dated August 1945. The last, December 1946. Every single one had been mailed from a place that shouldn't have existed anymore, a prisoner of war camp in the mountains of West Virginia that had officially closed 8 months before the final letter was sent. Before we dive into this story, I need to ask you something. Imagine writing letters home, pouring your heart into every word, believing your family will read them, only for those letters to never arrive. Think about that kind of isolation. If stories like this one matter to you, then click the like button and subscribe to the channel so you never miss another heartbreaking tale of the past. Also, leave a comment below telling us where you're watching from and what time it is there. We love hearing from our community around the world. Now let's continue with the story. Anneliese Vogel wrote her first letter home on August 9th, 1945. 3 months after Germany surrendered, she sat at a wooden table in the women's barracks at Camp Thornfield, West Virginia, and carefully formed each word in German script, telling her mother and younger sister Greta that she was alive, that she was well, that she would be home soon. The Red Cross had told them repatriation would begin in September. She described the mountains around her, how they reminded her of the Alps near their village. She mentioned the work she'd been assigned to, helping on a local farm owned by a man named Clayton Kavanaugh. She signed it, "Your Anneliese," and added a postscript asking about their neighbors, the Durs, and whether Greta had received the teaching position she'd applied for before the war. The letter went into a canvas bag with others from the camp, marked for Red Cross processing. It would sit in a warehouse in Philadelphia for 8 months before anyone noticed the address format was wrong, that the postal codes had been deliberately scrambled, that someone had made sure these letters would never reach Germany. Camp Thornfield sat in a hollow between 3 ridges in McDowell County, 9 miles from the nearest town. The facility had been built in 1943 to hold German POWs who would work the failing coal mines and desperate farms while American men fought overseas. By the time Anneliese arrived in November 1944, the camp held 264 prisoners. 247 were men. 17 were women, an administrative nightmare for military officials who had no protocols for female POWs. The solution was a separate barracks behind a second fence, 2 guards from the Women's Army Corps, and a policy of keeping the women's presence as quiet as possible. Anneliese had been captured near Aachen in October 1944, working as a communications auxiliary for a Wehrmacht unit that had already begun its collapse. She was 23 years old, spoke some English she'd learned in school, and had volunteered for service because the alternative was factory work in Munich making artillery shells. In her POW photograph, her face was thin, her blonde hair pulled back tight, her expression carefully blank. She looked like 10,000 other young German women who'd found themselves on the wrong side of history. The Kavanaugh farm was 4 miles from the camp, accessible by a rutted dirt road that wound through thick woods and across 2 creek beds that flooded every spring. Clayton Kavanaugh was 31 years old, a Marine Corps veteran who'd been discharged in 1944 after taking shrapnel in his left leg at Guadalcanal. He'd come home to a struggling farm, a wife named Judith who'd grown hard in his absence, and debts that multiplied faster than he could count them. When the camp commandant offered POW labor to local farmers in the spring of 1945, Clayton accepted immediately. He needed help. The corn wasn't planted, the garden was overrun with weeds, and Judith couldn't manage the work alone. They sent him Annalise in May 1945. She arrived in a military truck driven by a camp guard who told Clayton the basics. She was a prisoner. She would work from dawn until dusk. He was responsible for her transportation back to camp each evening. The guard handed him a clipboard to sign and drove away, leaving Annalise standing in the yard with a canvas bag containing her few possessions, looking at the farmhouse and the fields beyond it, and the mountains that rose up on all sides like walls. Judith watched from the porch, arms crossed, her face showing nothing. Clayton limped forward, favoring his bad leg, and said in slow English, "You understand work?" Annalisa nodded. He pointed to the garden. She nodded again and walked toward it without another word. That night, the truck came back and took her to the camp. The next morning, it brought her back. This continued through the summer, 6 days a week, a routine that felt almost normal until the war ended, and the routine should have ended with it. The letters Annalise wrote in those first months after surrender were full of hope that would later feel like a cruel joke. In her August 19th letter, she told her mother about the American guards who smiled at her, who sometimes shared their cigarettes with the women prisoners. She described the kindness of Mrs. Carmichael, one of the Women's Army Corps guards, who had given her a pair of better work boots when she noticed Annalise's were falling apart. She wrote about the Red Cross representative who visited the camp in early September and assured them all that ships were being prepared, that they would be home by Christmas, at the latest. In her September 7th letter, she mentioned Clayton Kavanaugh directly for the first time. She wrote that he was a quiet man, that his wife rarely spoke to her, but that they fed her lunch each day, and the work was not as hard as it could have been. She said Clayton had been a soldier too, that he understood what it meant to be far from home. She didn't mention that he sometimes watched her work with an expression she couldn't read, or that Judith's silence felt heavier than anger. By October, the tone shifted slightly. The Red Cross representative hadn't returned. The other women in the barracks were growing anxious, trading rumors about delays in ship availability, about complications with the new German government, about prisoners being held longer than promised. Annalisa wrote on October 23rd that she was trying to be patient, that surely the paperwork would be processed soon. She asked if her mother had received her earlier letters. She asked if Greta was well. She asked if their house had survived the bombings. The questions accumulated like debts she couldn't pay. November brought the first real warning, though Annalise didn't recognize it as such. On November 4th, 1945, Clayton told her she wouldn't be going back to camp that evening. He said the commandant had approved extended work assignments for some prisoners, that she would stay in a small room off the kitchen, that transportation costs were becoming difficult for the camp to manage. He said this while not quite meeting her eyes. Judith stood in the doorway behind him, silent. The room was barely large enough for a cot and a small table. There was a window that looked out toward the barn, but it had been nailed shut. Clayton brought her belongings from the camp the next day in a cardboard box. He said the camp was starting to close down, that most of the male prisoners had already been transferred. He said she was lucky to have work, that some prisoners were being sent to larger facilities farther away. He said the war was over, but Germany was still dangerous, still unstable, that it might be better to wait a few more months before going back. She wrote to her mother that night by lamplight. She said she was staying at the farm now, helping more directly with the household. She said Clayton had promised to help with her paperwork, that he knew people who could speed up the repatriation process. She said she missed home terribly, but that everything would be fine. She addressed the envelope the way Clayton had shown her, copying the format he'd written on a scrap of paper. She didn't know he'd deliberately written it wrong. On December 15th, Camp Thornfield officially closed. The last bus of male prisoners left at dawn. The women's barracks were empty by noon. The 17 female prisoners transferred to various locations, according to documents that would later prove impossible to verify. Annalisa Vogel's name appeared on a Boyd manifest for Camp Shanks in New York, a processing center for repatriation. She never arrived there. She was 4 miles away, sleeping in a room with a nailed window, writing letters that would never reach home, beginning to understand that something was wrong, but not yet understanding how wrong. Not yet understanding that Clayton Kavanaugh had no intention of ever letting her leave. The administrative chaos of demobilization swallowed people whole. In the months after the war ended, thousands of German POWs moved through a system that was collapsing under its own weight. Processing centers were overwhelmed, paperwork went missing, and in the confusion, people simply disappeared from official records. This wasn't intentional evil. It was bureaucratic failure on a massive scale, and it created opportunities for men like Clayton Kavanaugh. The documents that survived tell a fractured story. Camp Thornfield's closure report, filed on December 20th, 1945, listed all prisoners as successfully transferred. A secondary manifest from Camp Shanks, dated January 3rd, 1946, showed discrepancies in the number of female POWs received versus those supposedly transferred. An inquiry was noted. Then nothing. The file went cold. In the National Archives, there's a single-page addendum dated March 1946, stating that records regarding female auxiliary prisoners from Camp Thornfield require further verification, with a handwritten note at the bottom that simply says, pending. Annalise wrote her December letters with increasing desperation barely contained beneath careful words. On December 9th, she told her mother that the repatriation had been delayed again, but that Clayton assured her it was only temporary. On December 22nd, she mentioned that she hadn't seen anyone from the camp in weeks, that Clayton said the military was reorganizing and she should be patient. On December 30th, her handwriting shakier than before, she asked if her mother had received any of her previous letters. "Please write back if you get this one. Please let me know you're alive." What she didn't write was that the door to her room now locked from the outside at night. She didn't write that Judith had taken her work boots and given her old house slippers instead. She didn't write that when she asked Clayton about going into town to use the telephone at the general store. He'd said it was better if she stayed out of sight, that people might not understand, that there was still a lot of anger about the war. She didn't write that she'd tried the window again and found it not just nailed, but now also wedged shut with wooden blocks she couldn't move. Sheriff Harlan Bledsoe made his first visit to the Kavanaugh farm on January 9th, 1946. His official report, discovered decades later in a box of miscellaneous county records, noted that he was conducting routine checks on farms that had used POW labor to ensure compliance with closure regulations. He observed one female prisoner still present on the property, assisting with household duties. Clayton Kavanaugh provided documentation showing an approved extension for agricultural labor through February. The sheriff noted no violations and recommended continued monitoring. What the report didn't include was the conversation Bledsoe had with his deputy, Frank Dutton, on the drive back to town. Dutton later told his daughter, who told a researcher in 1988, that Bledsoe had said the German girl looked scared, that something didn't feel right, but that Clayton was a Marine veteran. And besides, what were they supposed to do with her anyway? Send her back to Germany, where there was no food, no shelter, no law? Maybe she was better off working for room and board until things settled down. Maybe it wasn't their business. People in these mountains knew how to mind their own affairs. Annalise's January letters grew shorter. She stopped asking about her sister. She stopped describing the farm, or the mountains, or anything specific. She wrote that she was well, that she hoped everyone at home was safe, that she thought of them constantly. The words were hollow shells with nothing inside. On January 27th, she wrote one sentence that slipped through. "I don't think I'm going home." Then, as if catching herself, she added quickly, "I mean, not as soon as I hoped." But that first sentence sat there on the page like a confession she couldn't take back. Clayton Kavanaugh came back from the Pacific with nightmares that made him wake up screaming about men burning alive in bunkers. Judith had learned to sleep in the next room. She'd learned a lot of things in the 3 years he was gone, mostly that she could run the farm herself, and that marriage was just another kind of war where nobody won. When Clayton returned in 1944 with a limp and a medical discharge, she'd hoped things would get better. Instead, they got quieter, which was somehow worse. The farm was failing. 70 acres of rocky Appalachian soil that barely grew corn, a vegetable garden that required constant work, 6 chickens, 2 pigs, and debts at the Bramwell General Store that now exceeded $300. Clayton's disability pension was $42 a month. It wasn't enough. It would never be enough. And then there was the other problem, the one Judith never spoke about, but that sat between them like a third person at every meal. She couldn't have children. 3 doctors had confirmed it. Something about her anatomy, words Judith didn't fully understand, but that added up to a simple truth in a place where a woman's value was measured by the children she produced. She was 28 years old and barren, a word the women at church didn't say to her face, but that she heard in their silence. Clayton had never blamed her out loud, but she felt it anyway. The weight of his disappointment every time they saw a neighbor's child, every time his mother asked when they'd be starting a family. When Annalise Vogel arrived at the farm in May 1945, Judith saw her as just another mouth to feed. Then she noticed the way Clayton watched the German girl work, the way his face softened when Annalise thanked him in broken English for lunch. She noticed how young Annalise was, how blonde, how different from Judith's own dark hair and sharp features. She noticed and said nothing, because saying something would make it real. By February 1946, the dynamic had shifted in ways that were hard to name, but impossible to ignore. Annalise no longer asked about leaving. She worked from dawn until after dark, cooking, cleaning, tending the garden plot. Clayton had marked out for spring planting. She moved through the house like a ghost, present, but trying to take up no space, speaking only when spoken to. Judith watched her and felt something that might have been pity if pity didn't require seeing another person as fully human. The night of February 19th, Judith heard sounds from the room where Annalise slept. She stood in the hallway outside her own bedroom and listened to the floorboards creak, to the low murmur of Clayton's voice, to silence, to more creaking. She went back to bed and stared at the ceiling until dawn. The next morning, Annalise's face was carefully blank as she made breakfast. Clayton ate without looking at either of them. Judith said nothing, because what was there to say? When Annalise wrote her March 2nd letter, she mentioned feeling unwell. She said the mountain winter was hard, that she wasn't used to the cold. She said she hoped spring would come soon. She didn't mention that she'd missed her monthly bleeding, that Judith had noticed, and now watched her with a new kind of calculation in her eyes. That Clayton had started talking about the future in ways that made Annalise's stomach turn. She didn't mention that her POW identification papers had disappeared from her belongings, or that when she'd asked Clayton about them, he'd said they must have been lost in the camp closure. Not to worry, he'd get her new documents soon. She didn't mention that she'd stopped believing his promises, that she was beginning to understand she was no longer a prisoner of war. She was just a prisoner, and the war was over, which meant nobody was coming to look for her. By April, Annalisa could no longer hide what was happening to her body. Judith knew before she did, had been counting the weeks with grim precision. On April 7th, Judith told Clayton they needed to take the German girl to see Doc Hensley in town. Clayton said no. Too many questions. Too much risk. Judith insisted, her voice low and sharp in a way that made Clayton's jaw tighten. And finally he agreed, but only if they said Annalise was a distant cousin staying with them, that her husband had died in the war. Doc Hensley's office was above the drugstore in Bramwell, 2 rooms that smelled of carbolic acid and old tobacco. He was 63 years old and had been delivering babies in these mountains since before the First War. He examined Annalise while Judith waited outside, and Clayton sat in his truck smoking cigarettes with shaking hands. When they were done, Doc Hensley told Annalise to get dressed and called Judith back in. He said the girl was about 4 months along, healthy enough considering, due sometime in late August or early September. He looked at Judith when he said it, not at Annalise, as if she wasn't there. On the drive back, nobody spoke. Annalisa sat between them in the truck cab, her hands folded in her lap, watching the road disappear behind them. When they got home, Judith finally broke the silence. She told Annalise that the baby would be theirs, that this was how things were going to be, that if Annalise caused any trouble, she'd find herself in a jail cell or on a boat back to a country that didn't want her. She said it matter-of-factly, the way you'd explain how to plant tomatoes or preserve beans. Clayton stared straight ahead and said nothing, which was the same as agreement. That night, Annalise wrote the most desperate letter she'd ever written. She told her mother everything: the missing papers, the locked door, the baby. She wrote that she needed help, that someone needed to contact the Red Cross, that this wasn't right. She sealed the envelope and left it on the kitchen table where Clayton would find it in the morning to mail with the others. He read it, of course. They all knew he read them. He took it outside and burned it in the barrel where they'd disposed of trash. Then he came back inside and told Annalise that mail service had been disrupted, that it might be better to wait a few weeks before sending more letters. She tried to leave once. It was May 3rd, a Tuesday, while Clayton was in the far field and Judith had gone to her sister's house in Bramwell. Annalise walked down the dirt road toward town, moving as fast as her changing body would allow. She made it maybe 2 miles before she heard the truck engine behind her. Clayton didn't say anything when he pulled up beside her. He just opened the passenger door and waited. She stood there on the road, surrounded by mountains and trees and miles of emptiness, and understood there was nowhere to go. She got in the truck. What happened when they got back to the farm was something Annalise never wrote about in her letters. She never wrote about the bruises that took 2 weeks to fade, or the way her ribs hurt when she breathed deeply. She never wrote that the door to her room now had a bolt on the outside, or that Judith brought her meals on a tray 3 times a day, like she was an invalid. She never wrote that she'd stopped being a person and had become something else, something without a name, something that existed only to serve a purpose she hadn't agreed to. In her May 27th letter, wrote only that she was well, that the weather was warming, that she hoped her mother and sister were safe, The handwriting looked like it belonged to someone else. The mountains kept secrets better than any lock or chain. In McDowell County, people lived by an unspoken code. You didn't ask about what happened on another man's property. You didn't volunteer information to outsiders. And you certainly didn't involve yourself in family matters that weren't your concern. This wasn't cruelty exactly. It was survival in a place where community ties were everything, and breaking those ties could leave you isolated in ways that were dangerous. Virgil Tackett lived on the neighboring farm, half a mile through the woods from the Kavanaughs. He was 52 years old, a widower who'd lost his wife to pneumonia in 1943, and his only son to the war in France. He kept mostly to himself, but sometimes in the evenings he'd walk the property line checking fence posts, and from there he could see the Kavanaugh farmhouse, could see the figure of a woman working the garden even as summer heat made the air shimmer. He knew about the German POW. Everyone in the area knew Clayton had labor from the camp. What Virgil didn't know, or told himself he didn't know, was that the camp had closed months ago. In June, he saw Annalise hanging laundry on the line behind the house, her condition obvious even from a distance. He mentioned it to Harold Pritch at the general store in Bramwell, said he didn't know Clayton and Judith were expecting. Harold looked at him strangely and said they weren't, far as he knew. The conversation died there, both men suddenly very interested in other topics. That night, Virgil lay awake thinking about the German girl, about the way she moved through the yard like someone who'd forgotten how to stand up straight, and he told himself it wasn't his business. Sheriff Bledsoe made his second visit to the farm on June 14th. His report, filed 3 days later, noted that the female POW previously observed was still present and appeared to be in late-term pregnancy. Clayton Kavanaugh explained that the woman, a distant relative from Germany, had nowhere else to go and was helping with farm duties in exchange for room and board. When asked about the prisoner of war status, Clayton produced a letter, supposedly from the War Department, stating that certain POWs with no viable repatriation options had been released to private sponsorship. The letter looked official enough. Bledsoe noted it in his report and left. The letter was a forgery. Clayton had paid a man in Bluefield $20 to type it on stolen War Department letterhead. The same man had created other documents too, a birth certificate template, an affidavit of citizenship sponsorship, papers that would make a baby born in these mountains look like it belonged to Clayton and Judith Kavanaugh. The system was full of holes, and Clayton had learned to exploit every one. What Sheriff Bledsoe didn't include in his report was what his deputy Frank Dutton said as they drove away. That girl didn't look like anybody's relative, that she looked terrified, that maybe they should contact the federal authorities. Bledsoe replied that federal authorities had enough problems dealing with post-war chaos, that one German girl with a place to live was hardly their concern, that making trouble for a Marine veteran over paperwork irregularities wasn't something he planned to do. Dutton fell silent. He would think about that silence for the rest of his life. By July, Annalise had stopped writing letters entirely. When Judith asked why, Annalise said there was no point, that her family clearly wasn't receiving them, or they would have written back. Judith didn't correct her. The truth was that Clayton had been burning every letter since March, but letting Annalise believe her family had abandoned her served a purpose. It made her more compliant, more resigned. It made her easier to control. In the psychology of captivity, isolation is the most effective weapon, and Clayton wielded it with the same efficiency he'd once used to field strip a rifle. He understood that breaking someone wasn't about violence alone. It was about making them believe that the world outside had forgotten them, that resistance was pointless, that acceptance was the only path to survival. The baby came on August 23, 1946, during a thunderstorm that knocked out power lines across 3 counties. Annalise's water broke just after midnight. Judith sent Clayton to fetch Mabel Grundy, the midwife who lived 6 miles away near the old mining road. By the time Clayton returned with her, rain was coming down so hard the truck could barely make it back up the muddy drive, and Annalise was on the bed in her small room, breathing through contractions that felt like her body was tearing itself apart. Mabel Grundy had delivered 217 babies in 40 years of midwifery. She was 61 years old, weathered and practical, and she asked no questions when Judith handed her $50 in cash and said there would be no birth certificate filed, no records kept. Mabel had delivered babies under those terms before. In these mountains, sometimes babies came into the world quietly, and that was just how things were. She washed her hands in the basin Judith provided and got to work. The labor lasted 9 hours. Annalise screamed in German, words Mabel didn't understand, but recognized as prayers or curses or both. Judith stayed in the kitchen, refusing to be in the room. Clayton sat on the porch, smoking cigarettes and listening to the rain and the sounds coming from inside the house. When the baby finally came at 9:37 in the morning, it was a girl, 6 pounds and 4 ounces, with blonde hair plastered to her tiny skull and lungs that worked perfectly as she announced her arrival to the world. Mabel cleaned the baby and wrapped her in a blanket, then placed her in Annalise's arms. For exactly 43 seconds, Annalise held her daughter. She looked at the small face, touched the tiny fingers, and felt something break inside her that was different from anything Clayton had broken before. Then Judith came into the room and took the baby away. She held the child against her chest and said, "Her name is Sarah. Sarah Kavanaugh." She said it to Mabel, not to Annalise, as if Annalise wasn't there, as if Annalise had been nothing but a vessel, and now that vessel had served its purpose. Annalise tried to speak, tried to say something, but Judith cut her off. She said if Annalise made any trouble, if she breathed a word to anyone, Clayton would drive her to the sheriff and claim she'd tried to steal their baby, that as a German POW with no legal status, she'd be deported or jailed, that either way, she'd never see the child again. She said if Annalise cooperated, if she stayed quiet and continued working, she could stay in the house and watch her daughter grow up. It was the only mercy she'd get, and it wasn't a mercy at all. It was another kind of prison. Mabel Grundy left with her $50 and never spoke of that birth to anyone until 1991, when she was dying of cancer, and told her daughter the story. She said it had bothered her for 45 years, the look on that German girl's face when they took the baby, the way Annalise had curled up on the bed afterward and made no sound at all. She said she should have done something, but didn't know what, and by the time she thought maybe she should have called someone, enough time had passed that speaking up seemed worse than staying quiet. In the weeks after the birth, Annalise existed in a fog. She performed her duties mechanically, cooking and cleaning, while Judith carried Sarah around the house, cooing at her, showing her off to visitors as our miracle baby after years of trying. Annalise was introduced to these visitors as hired help, a girl from town who needed work. Nobody questioned it. Nobody looked too closely. And Annalise said nothing, because what was there to say? Because Judith had been right about one thing. If Annalise left, she'd never see her daughter again. And somehow, that was worse than staying. Annalise began writing letters again in September, not to her mother, not to Greta, but to the baby she couldn't claim. She wrote them in German on scraps of paper she hid beneath the loose floorboard under her cot. She wrote about what she would tell Sarah if she could, about the village in Bavaria where Anneliese had grown up, about the lake where she'd learned to swim, about her own mother's laugh. She wrote apologies for things Sarah would never understand, and promises she knew she couldn't keep. The letters to her family, the ones Clayton made her write and pretended to mail, became something else entirely. Empty words on paper, a performance of normalcy that fooled no one, least of all herself. On October 12th, Anneliese asked Judith if she could hold Sarah, just for a moment, just to feel the weight of her. Judith considered it, then placed the baby in Anneliese's arms under her watchful eye. Sarah was 7 weeks old, her eyes beginning to focus, her tiny hands grasping at air. Anneliese held her and felt her heart compress into something dense and painful. She handed Sarah back after less than a minute because anything longer would have destroyed her completely. That night, she made her decision. She would leave. Not to escape, because escape was impossible with Sarah here, but to find help. There had to be someone, some authority, some organization that could fix this. The Red Cross, the military. Someone who would listen and understand that a woman and a baby had been stolen from the world, that documents could be forged, but truth still mattered. She waited until mid-November, when Clayton would be gone for 2 days, buying winter feed in Bluefield, and Judith would be managing the farm alone. The morning of November 18th, Anneliese woke before dawn. She'd saved $4 from money Judith occasionally gave her for small tasks, hidden in the hem of her one decent dress. She had a plan, crude but possible. Walk to Bramwell, find the sheriff, demand he contact federal authorities. She'd tell everything, show the scars, produce the forged documents if she could find them, make someone listen. The risk was enormous, but so was staying silent. She made it to the end of the driveway before Judith appeared from the barn with Clayton's hunting rifle. Judith didn't point it at her, just held it loose in her hands, and said very quietly that Anneliese needed to come back inside. Anneliese stood frozen, calculating whether she could run, whether Judith would actually shoot. Then Judith said, "If you leave, I'll tell Clayton the baby isn't his. I'll tell him she's sickly, that we should give her to the county orphanage. You know what those places are like." Anneliese walked back to the house. That afternoon, while Anneliese sat in her locked room, Judith fed Sarah and rocked her and sang a lullaby that Anneliese could hear through the walls. It was psychological warfare of the cruelest kind, and it worked. Anneliese understood that Sarah was both the reason she had to escape and the reason she never could. Her final letters began in December. She wrote to her mother on December 3rd that she was well, that she hoped everyone was safe, just the same hollow phrases as before. On December 18th, she wrote what would be her last letter to Germany. In it, she described a barn on the eastern edge of the property, mentioned it had a loose board near the ground, mentioned she kept important things there in case something happened. She signed it with her childhood nickname, Liesel. She put it in the envelope Clayton would supposedly mail, knowing he'd burn it like all the others, but needing to write it anyway, needing to leave some record of the truth, even if no one would ever read it. On January 3rd, 1947, Anneliese Vogel made one biennial entry in the diary she'd been keeping hidden with the letters to Sarah. She wrote that she couldn't do this anymore, that watching her daughter call another woman mama was killing her slowly, that she'd rather die quickly. She wrote that she was sorry, that she'd tried. Rachel Zimmer was 26 years old in the spring of 1987, working on her doctoral dissertation about post-war POW repatriation at Georgetown University. She'd spent 8 months in the National Archives, drowning in bureaucratic records, when she found the discrepancy in Camp Thornfield's closure documents. Female prisoners listed on transfer manifests who never appeared at their designated processing centers. Names that vanished between one facility and another. 17 women reduced to paper ghosts. Most researchers would have noted it as typical wartime administrative chaos and moved on. Rachel couldn't. She'd grown up hearing her grandmother's stories about displaced persons camps, about people who'd been lost in the machinery of war and never found. She started making calls. The Department of Defense had no additional records. The Red Cross had a file on Camp Thornfield, but nothing about individual prisoners. She found a phone number for the McDowell County Sheriff's Office and called on a Tuesday afternoon in April. The current sheriff, Dennis Kowalski, had never heard of Camp Thornfield. He transferred her to the county clerk, who transferred her to the Historical Society, where a woman named Phyllis Brandt said yes, there'd been a POW camp during the war, closed down in 45 or 46, and if Rachel wanted to see the area, she was welcome to visit. Rachel drove down 3 weeks later with a tape recorder, a camera, and a list of names that included Annalise Vogel. Phyllis Brandt was 73 years old and had lived in McDowell County her entire life. She remembered the camp, remembered some local farms using POW labor, remembered it all ending when the war did. Rachel asked about the female prisoners. Phyllis's face changed slightly, a flicker of something that might have been recognition or might have been discomfort. She said there'd been talk years ago about one of them staying on with a family, working as hired help, but that was just rumor, and anyway, it was ancient history. Rachel asked which family. Phyllis hesitated, then said the Kavanaughs, but they'd moved away in the 60s after Clayton died, and Judith had passed in 79, and really it was all just old gossip, probably not worth pursuing. Rachel wrote down the name. That evening, she drove out to the property, which had been abandoned for years. The farmhouse was still standing, but barely, windows broken, porch sagging. The barn was in worse shape, its roof half collapsed. She spent an hour walking the property, taking photographs, feeling like she was chasing shadows. Then she remembered something from Annalise's final letter, the one that had sat in that Red Cross mailbag with all the others. A loose board on the eastern wall of the barn. Rachel walked around the structure until she found the eastern side, mostly intact. She started checking boards near the ground, pulling at anything that seemed loose. The third board came away easily. Behind it, wrapped in oilcloth that had protected them for 40 years, were the documents that would finally tell the truth. Annalise's POW identification papers, with her photograph still visible. A diary written in German, its pages filled with careful handwriting. A stack of letters addressed to Meine kleine Sarah, my little Sarah, and folded at the bottom, a child's tiny sock, hand-knitted, impossibly small. Rachel sat in the dirt beside the barn and read the diary as the sun set over the mountains. She read about the locked room, the forced birth, the stolen child, the systematic erasure of a woman's entire existence. She read the final entry dated January 3rd, 1947, and understood she was holding evidence of a crime that no one had ever been punished for, because no one had ever looked. The next morning, she contacted the FBI. The FBI investigation opened in June 1987, 40 years too late to bring criminal charges against anyone involved. Clayton Kavanaugh had died of a heart attack in 1963. Judith had followed in 79. Sheriff Harlan Bledsoe had passed in 72. The witnesses who remained were elderly, their memories convenient fog, their testimonies variations of, "I didn't know," and It wasn't my place to ask. What the investigation did accomplish was finding Sarah. She was 40 years old, living in Columbus, Ohio, working as a dental hygienist, married with 2 children of her own. She'd grown up believing Clayton and Judith Kavanaugh were her biological parents, that she'd been their miracle baby after years of trying. When FBI agents knocked on her door in August 1987 and told her the truth, she didn't believe them. Then they showed her the diary, the letters, the photograph from Annalise's POW file. Sarah looked at the picture of a young German woman with blonde hair and recognized her own face staring back across 41 years. The hardest part was what came next. The investigation tried to determine what happened to Annalise after that final diary entry in January 1947. Judith Kavanaugh, in a 1982 interview for a county oral history project, had mentioned they'd employed a girl from town to help with housework in the late 40s, but that she'd left to find other work sometime in 47. No one had thought to ask for details. No one had cared enough to wonder where she'd gone. In October 1988, forensic investigators excavated portions of the Kavanaugh property based on ground-penetrating radar anomalies. They found remains in a shallow grave near the tree line, 200 yards from the house. Dental records were impossible because Annalise's had never been taken, but DNA testing, still relatively new in 1988, confirmed a maternal match to Sarah. The bones showed evidence of blunt force trauma to the skull. The coroner estimated time of death at 40 to 42 years prior, consistent with early 1947. Sarah Kavanaugh, who'd learned her name was really Sarah Vogel, stood at the gravesite and tried to process that she was looking at her mother's final resting place. A mother she'd never known, who'd been murdered so Sarah could be raised by the people who'd killed her. She thought about all the years growing up, the mother who'd seemed cold and distant, the father who'd barely looked at her, the feeling she'd always had of not quite belonging. Now she knew why. The letters Annalise had written to Sarah, hidden in the barn, became Sarah's only connection to a woman who'd loved her desperately enough to endure hell for the chance to stay near her. In one letter, Annalise had written, "You have my eyes and my mother's smile. I hope you grow up knowing you are loved, even if you never know by whom." Sarah read that at the funeral they held for Annalise in November 1988, 41 years after her death, and understood that some losses can't be measured, some debts can never be repaid. The case raised questions that echoed far beyond McDowell County. How many other women had disappeared in the chaos of post-war demobilization? How many people had looked the other way when they should have spoken up? How many crimes had been buried in these mountains simply because no one with power cared enough to dig? The final report from the investigation, filed in March 1989, concluded that Annalise Vogel had been systematically imprisoned, assaulted, and ultimately murdered by Clayton and Judith Kavanaugh, with the complicity of local authorities who failed in their duty to protect her. The report noted that geographic isolation, bureaucratic failure, and social attitudes that devalued both foreign nationals and women had created conditions where such crimes could occur with impunity. No one was ever charged. Everyone responsible was dead. Justice, if it came at all, came only in the telling, in making sure Annalise Vogel's name was remembered, that her daughter knew the truth, that the letters she'd written in that small room finally reached someone who would read them and understand what they cost. Sarah visits the grave twice a year. She brings flowers and speaks to a mother she never knew in a language she doesn't speak. And sometimes, in the quiet of those mountain hollows, the wind sounds almost like an answer. If this story moved you and made you think about the invisible people history forgets, then click that like button and subscribe to this channel. We tell these stories because someone needs to remember, because the past isn't really past until we acknowledge what happened in it. More forgotten voices, more buried truths, more stories that demand to be told are coming. Don't miss them.